It's time to grab a bite in E3M01 The Storehouse. As you probably noticed, I don't often complain about something feeling cheap, but I'd say this map fits that bill. While I mentioned the crater potentially running out of ammo, I was forced to run here so that I could grab a dragon claw to somewhat fight back with. Admittedly, it does loosen up ever so slightly later on, but 2 iron liches really hurt this early on. Usually in Heretic maps, I end up with a surplus of stuff, including multiple power-ups that you can only bring one of through to the next map, so this was pretty jarring. I'm not going to say it's the worst map ever, of course, and Ophidians are nicely thematically appropriate as guards of this space, as are the visuals in general, like the tiles and skybox. It's only a shame that the map just feels so much like it's cheap-shotting you with low ammo rather than trying to give you genuine difficulty. It's time to park that bigger boat in E1M01 The Docks. Right out of the gate, it gives you a good idea of what to expect with an emphasis on dark environments and projectiles due to its medieval theme. It's definitely a very solid opening map, making good use of brightness and height levels and having just enough difficulty on Thou Art a Smite Meister, which is the ultra-violence equivalent, to make you sweat a bit. 3 undead warriors stand as the toughest part since they're spongier and fire projectiles, but nothing you shouldn't be able to handle. It's not the most open-ended map in the world, but it's got 4 secrets with some pretty good rewards like chainsaw, shotgun, and backpack equivalents. As a whole, I'd say it's a good map that makes good use of Intake 1 to create a nice environment, and a Tome of Power shows off the Duke 3D style handheld inventory nicely if you can find the secret for it. Let me in. Let me in! E1M03 The Gatehouse. In some ways, this map feels like a step down, like being smaller and only having 2 secrets, so not as much room for exploration. It also introduces the Fire Gargoyle, looking identical to the regular gargoyles and throwing projectiles at you for confusion, so not a fan of them, though that's not an issue with the map directly. In general, the map certainly heats up the difficulty with 21 undead warriors in the 2 higher settings, for example. Probably the most interesting room is the one with the green door because it has multiple platforms with ammo that come down for you when you enter. As a whole, though, the map feels like it's over too quickly and relies more on things like opening monster closets. It's time to chill at the bottom in E2M01 The Crater. Fair warning if you're playing on Thou Art a Smite Meister, the map can be pretty stingy on ammo near the beginning. I actually had to melee at least 1 enemy. This, along with introducing were-dragons, means it's actually fairly difficult for the starter map of an episode. At least it also introduces the Hell Staff in a secret, which is basically a plasma rifle equivalent. The map feels fairly condensed apart from that, and pretty lacking in visual distinction. Only having 45 monsters and 2 secrets that are both in the same room, perhaps it was short to compensate for its difficulty. It also technically has a mandatory hazardous floor, but you have access to a flight power-up to get around it. Overall, it has a decent amount of challenge and the Hell Staff is nice, but I feel the map could be a bit longer, even by the standards of a starter map. It's time to measure the wetness of rocks in E3M09 The Aquifier. I hope you like iron liches because this map has a ton of them, 4 in one area and another 2 in the exit. Not that that's really saying too much since Phoenix rods still melt them like hot butter, but it's certainly the most numerous they've been so far. The theme of being bombarded with enemies is actually repeated where a surprising amount of disciples come after you at once, though amusingly some of them got caught in the crusher. The water theme of the map seems to be a bit half-baked though, mostly just a large center room with waterfalls on all ends, which doesn't scream carefully crafted aquatics to me. I know I've called so many maps average or just alright, but this sort of feels like it has little to nothing new to offer, though at least there's a nice horseshoe design with the windows into the center room. It's time to go down deep in E2M09 The Glacier. This is one of those maps that's alright, but not great, because it feels a little formulaic. Even the 2 iron liches in different locations, mind you, feel like it's getting pretty expected at this point. About the only genuinely interesting thing in the entire map is ice steps that you could potentially fall off of if you're not careful. Now, I will say that it's pretty nice visually, combining some of the best art assets of Heretic maps to create a pleasing and varied design. It's only a shame that the gameplay of the map doesn't really do much at all that new, and it mostly felt like white noise getting through it. Maybe it's because it's the 14th map of Heretic, so by now you've seen most of their bag of tricks. I'll emphasize that it's not a bad map by any means, it was fine getting through, I just didn't find it all that memorable. It's time to dodge some teeth in E1M08 Hell's Maw. It has some similarities with Phobos Anomaly, mainly that it has multiple of the first boss, in this case 3 Iron Liches. Funny enough, I didn't find the Iron Liches themselves all that tough, and it was the rest of the minions in the same map I mostly had some difficulty with. You can say that's another slight similarity with Phobos Anomaly if you count the unavoidable loss area you teleport into with minions all over you. Since it's a boss map, it's not that long as you may expect, but at least it isn't just one singular room, so I can appreciate that. The Iron Liches, though not the most difficult, also have some creative attacks like a tornado they spin you up in. Like the Barons, they also apparently return in the subsequent episodes as normal enemies, so it sort of makes sense that they aren't the hardest enemies ever. Overall, I'd say a decent boss map. It's time to pray for those inevitable crimes in E1M06 The Cathedral. True to the map's name, it starts out with cathedral pews and is mostly indoors with one exception. That's not a bad thing, of course, and the map still feels pretty significantly beefy. I'm, of course, never a fan of mandatory secrets, but at the very least it's not that hard to find, even if it's still a bit annoying. It's kind of funny that there's a graveyard when the secret exit leads to a graveyard map. It's sort of like the gun district on Duke 64 with a Duke Burger. From a gameplay perspective, the map is about average, not exactly great, but it didn't frustrate me either. Visually is where I'd say the map gets most of its merits from, with things like murals doing much of the heavy lifting. It's time to apply some extra strength deodorant to E2M02 The Lava Pits. Of note is it introduces a new enemy type, the Saber Claw, but thankfully they're melee only and pretty non-threatening compared to most. What isn't quite so non-threatening is the mandatory hazardous floor you're forced to hop through right from the beginning. Interestingly, as I mentioned before, Iron Liches would start appearing as regular enemies, and this is the first, though thankfully there's only one and it's optional. I'm noticing that the more ashy appearance for this episode doesn't lend itself nearly as well visually, though at least there's some yellow and red flag banners to help add some flair. Overall, it's not a terrible map, it even has some upsides to it, but I'd say it's overall not as strong as many other maps so far. It's time to rest eternally in E2M05 The Catacombs. This one's another solid one, with a respectable 6 secrets to encourage exploration, even in hazardous areas. It's mostly a trek through water, both current and static variants, which mostly isn't really a problem getting through. Visually, there's a mix of underground caverns and a bit of man-made structure, including a nice-looking mural for what's probably a ritual given the corpse hanging over a pool of water. Thankfully, the hazardous floor isn't really required, and you can even use a flight power-up located conveniently in the map if you want to get around it for the optional stuff. Other than that, and weirdly including the yellow key on just a ledge at the start, there really isn't that much to say about the map. It's a serviceable map that doesn't really do anything particularly annoying apart from arguably the currents if you want to go against them. It's time to plunge into the darkness in E3M07 The Chasm. This is potentially the easiest Molotov fight since you fight him on a ledge where he can't charge at you, although his long-ranged attacks still hurt. It isn't the hardest of the maps, but it still provides a decent sweater for the penultimate of Heretic's first 3 episodes, and 5 Iron Liches are decent when 3 are packed together. The Windy Hall to get the blue key, where you can also fly around to get goodies in, was also nicely unique, probably the most fun use of the flying power-up, honestly. The rest of the map is fine with a central water area and good use of heights throughout to give it that good old sense of 3D depth. The living end this isn't, but it's still a pretty decent penultimate map for the episode, and at least it isn't exactly bad. It at least also has some unique spots, like a secret leading to a sequence of teleporters with saber claws. It's time to get soaked in E3M03 The Confluence. I'm really glad I stopped pistol starting these ranking maps, because this one pits an Iron Lich on you among a sea of other enemies literally right at the start. Thankfully, I came in fully armed, so you're only going to find yourself lacking as a self-imposed challenge rather than being forced to. I know I sound like a broken record by now, but the rest of the map is merely okay. It makes good use of that old revisiting rooms from a different angle thing Doom maps had with the waterfalls at least. In general, it makes pretty good use of heights and brightness values to add depth to the world, which isn't something I often talk about, but is put to good use here. Ultimately, it's another one of those pretty good maps that goes into the same expected gameplay loop once you get past the initially pretty tough horde at the beginning. It's time to slither into E3M05 The Ophidian Lair. If there's a map to go hard on you for wanting to be a completionist, it's this one, having 2 Iron Liches and a Molotov locked in one room. Thankfully, you don't technically have to get into the cage with them, and the rest of the map is nowhere near that level, though not a pushover either. A good amount of Saber Claws and Disciples also roam the map, so it never gets entirely easy, but very much in line with the expected combat loop. As you can probably expect by the map's name, it has a healthy amount of Ophidians as well as some nice use of some aesthetically pleasing water tiles. Overall, past the 3 mini-boss pileup, the map isn't too distinguished or hard, but what's there is enough to keep from getting boring and has an overall nice enough design. It's time to keep your voice down as we infiltrate E1M04 The Guard Tower. It's an alright map, mainly looking like a dockside port with the actual guard tower taking place in the latter half of the map. I will say this, as you'd probably expect, there's a good use of height elevation, making the guard tower feel fittingly tall as you climb up it. The dock looks visually nice, even if the buildings mostly boil down to a hallway or a room in each. My one real con is it's not the lengthiest map ever with only a single actual secret, but at least there's a good sense of scale for what's actually there. It also introduces the Disciple of Despairol, an enemy that goes in and out of a ghostly state and throws magical orbs at you, but thankfully only up to 3 of them appear. Ultimately, the map is fine, there's enough content to keep it from feeling too short, and it makes good use of id-Tech1 features. It's time to go underground in E1M07 The Crypts. While the map name led me to believe it would be more like the Graveyard map, it has a good amount of variety to its visual design. From water to indoors to a tower with corrosive slime around it, it never stays to any one look for too long, which I can appreciate. Gameplay-wise, it's another one of those maps that I can only really say is alright, rather than especially groundbreaking. At least it has some cool-looking coffins getting close to the exit, adding to visual appeal, and one with sparkles that teleports to backtrack. It's a beefy enough map overall, and it doesn't really have anything in it that irritates me, even though you can say that about a lot of maps. Crusher Ceiling Stand is one of its more unique elements, which is thankfully not much more than potentially a mild weight. It's time to say hello to the zombies in E1M09 The Graveyard. Befitting the map's theme, every Golem, Nitro Golem, and Undead Warrior are ghost variants, making up about 2/3 of the map's enemies. The map is also pretty beefy by the usual secret map standards, sporting all 3 keys and just generally having a good amount to do despite only 2 secrets. It's also surprisingly difficult since the Undead Warrior ghosts always fling red axes which can take up to 56 health with 1 hit. The only part of the map I'd even nitpick about really is a piston platform room that involves a little waiting, which can be a little irritating but can be mitigated by the platforms being different heights. Overall, it pleasantly surprised me since I sort of expected a shallow gimmicky secret map, but there's enough there to make it feel like a complete map in its own right. It's time to look for precious gems in E3M04 The Azure Fortress. I'm conflicted because this may be the most beautiful map so far, but it almost feels like it overhyped itself a little for difficulty. It flat out gives you an invincibility ring near the beginning, not to mention the abundance of powerful ammo like orbs for the Phoenix Rod, though it's not the first to do that. Funny thing is the map ends up with 3 iron liches, but they're behind a window so their tornadoes can't reach you, making them kind of laughable, especially with the Phoenix Rod to melt them. Maybe that's on me for setting my expectations so high with a generous amount of items, and I'd certainly rather it be too generous than too stingy. It's still a visually very good looking map, and the gameplay loop isn't bad, I just sort of set myself up for disappointment by thinking it was going to lead to something more. It's time to get filthy in E3M02 The Cesspool. Just by virtue of it not feeling like you're constantly undersupplied, it's a huge improvement over what came before it. It's definitely much easier to appreciate things like the beautiful tiles in the dome skybox when things actually feel fair. It also helps that the map potentially completes your arsenal if you go for the secrets, even containing the big behemoth known as the Phoenix Rod. Visually, I like the water theme present throughout, especially the circular pool room, which manages to look nice despite id-Tech1's limitations. Interestingly, there's still an iron lich at the exit, but it's only 1 this time, which is much easier to manage. All in all, it's a pretty fun map to play through and is pretty visually gorgeous, which is ironic given the map's less than appealing sounding name. It's time to face your nightmares in E3M06 The Halls of Fear. As the first map with a mandatory Molitar, not to mention up to 4 iron liches, it definitely raises the stakes just ever so slightly more. The map design sort of reminds me of some Episode 1 maps like Catacombs with the bodies of water around, actually making it one of the better of Episode 3's water-themed maps. It was probably the first non-boss map where I felt like I was strapped for health because I was taking some punishment, and I mean that in the best way possible. Ophidians behind an invisible window was a bit of a cheap move, but at least you can get back there yourself potentially to fight back on them should you so desire. With honestly most of Heretic's maps just kind of being there and fading into the background, this map really stands apart in a good way and actually gave me the right amount of sweat-inducing. It's time to get all aperture in E2M08 The Portals of Chaos. I would sort of compare it to Armageddon's Lair from Quake in that it has a surprisingly capable boss, or in this case 3 of them with Molotars. Fire trails, a flurry of fireballs, a freaking bum rush attack. These big boys mean business, and if you aren't prepared with power-ups, they can be hell trying to take out. The map itself isn't too deep, being mainly a boss map, but it does have an outer court full of enemies and a couple of secrets to provide some depth. There's even a single Iron Lich, amusingly enough. Seems that the former episode's boss is now relegated to a brief cameo. This is one of those cases where I'm actually not going to complain at all about a map's length or complexity. This is more than I expected for a boss map. It exceeded my expectations both in terms of overall layout and the bosses themselves providing a very good challenge. It's time to warm up in E2M03 The River of Fire. Given the shape, it probably could have just as easily been called the Ring of Fire. It actually reminds me a bit of the O of Destruction from Doom 2. Instead of having hazards around the ring, though, it's walled off and the hazard is in the exact center of the ring going around it. Perhaps the biggest downside to the map is it has virtually no secrets, so what you see is what you get. Still, there's a reason I love O of Destruction so much, and this largely gets that. Big ring with progression around it. A were-dragon trap past the green key with what seems to be a nice floor with no friction is certainly unique. It's pretty cool that Heretic can have these kinds of properties for floors. Ultimately, it's a straightforward map, no secrets and not the longest, but what's there is what I consider a very good map in terms of overall quality. I hope you're hungry because it's time for some luncheons in the dungeons, E1M02. So far so good, it's a nice progression over the first map for content and adding a fair amount of inventory items in addition to a chain gun equivalent. Technically, it has a bit of a mandatory hazardous trek, but thankfully it's brief and a later secret lets you circumvent it if you missed anything over there. The way forward is technically a bit linear, but there's 7 secret areas and enough room for exploration that it never feels straight-lined. There are some inventory items like partial invisibility and a torch that are more akin to Doom, but some like throwing down hourglass bombs and even flying are definitely unique. Thankfully, while the environments have a lot of gray brick, there's also enough variation in colors that it feels overall vibrant and befitting a medieval fantasy setting in all honesty. It's time to scale some walls in E1M05 The Citadel. In contrast to the previous map, it's less dock and more actual town that still has bodies of water, which is an improvement to me because the buildings have more to them. It's slightly offset by the final area having a bit less to it, being more of a small gauntlet than something to really scale, but as a whole, the map is more feature complete. As expected, it makes very good use of height variations in addition to brightness levels with indoor and underground areas. It giving you a flight power-up at the end is kind of funny since it makes certain secrets easy to just head to directly instead of having to actually find them, not that they're hard to find either. Ultimately, I think it's a very good map that takes the visual themes of the previous map and makes them ultimately better. It's time to cool off in E2M04 The Ice Grotto. As the name suggests, it starts out in a great big area full of the frictionless blue cold stuff. This could easily lead to a cheap-feeling map, but thankfully it doesn't make things that much harder and doesn't overstay its welcome. I was actually a little concerned that the little village in the second half might be a point of no return, but you get both a flight power-up and a teleport out in case you run through that. This is good since the secret exit is here and you need to be able to get back over there to access it. This also marks the first inclusion of a regular enemy Iron Lich along a mandatory path, but is easily melted with a Hell Staff, one of which can be found right next to it if you didn't already have one. Overall, I think it's a very solid map that starts out strong with a slip and slide through a vast area graduating into tighter village buildings. It's time to spiral into E3M08 Disparal's Keep. So it's a boss map, which means you can't expect too much in terms of map complexity, but at least there's enough to serve as a nice build-up. Disparal himself is a pretty good boss with the first phase on a Chaos Serpent that would later become an enemy in Hexen and a second phase of Disparal teleporting around. He also summons regular disciples to pelt you with and you can die pretty quickly if you're not careful, making it a genuinely intense fight by Doom Engine standards. The ending even nicely foreshadows what would later be to come with Hexen and the other Serpent Riders, so it serves as an equally good sequel hook. Ultimately, this map is proof that you don't need an overly complex map design for it to be a very satisfying and thrilling boss map, and what a way to end the original 3 episodes of Heretic. It's time to overview this hectic ride that is Heretic. As what was essentially the first commercial id Tech 1 game to actually evolve the engine, Heretic honestly propelled the engine in some exciting ways. It brought forth an inventory system, some very unique at the time power-ups like a Tomb of Power to give weapon alt fires, a silly power-up to turn enemies into chickens, even a power-up to fly along with looking up and down. It even had some interestingly complex scripted things such as floors that pull you in different directions and a final boss that can teleport around. While Hexen and especially Strife would later go on to push id Tech 1 to an even greater degree, Heretic deserves credit for breaking a lot of ground in this field. It's not only very fun to play, better than Hexen in my opinion because it keeps things pretty simple, but its effects will be seen in years to come with id Tech 1 mods like for Z-Doom that it laid the foundation for.